Welcome, sleepless spirit. I'm your storyteller tonight, here to guide you gently into the shadows of slumber, where dreams take over and worries fade away. Before we begin, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more bedtime tales, whispered just for you. Let me know in the comments, where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it as you listen tonight? And if there's a story you've been longing to hear, something spooky, something comforting, tell me. I'm always listening. Now, tuck yourself in. Let the darkness wrap around you like a warm blanket. It's time to let go and drift into the story. After more than 15 years of 18-wheeler driving, Mike Henderson came across something that would follow him for the rest of his life. On a chilly February evening in 2018, Mike was traveling down Interstate 25 from Phoenix to Denver with a load of electronics. He was accustomed to the loneliness, the long miles of pitch-black roadway, and the peculiar cast of personalities that appeared after midnight because he was a seasoned night driver. However, he was unprepared for what transpired during those frightful hours between 2 a.m. and dawn. Just outside of Albuquerque, New Mexico, the trouble began. A battered white vehicle was parked in the shadows close to the edge of the lot when Mike stopped into a truck stop to get coffee and look at his logbook. The car itself wasn't out of the ordinary. Across America, truck stops were dotted with several broken-down cars. His gaze was drawn to the lifeless man sitting behind the wheel, looking straight at him through the glass. It looked like a middle-aged man with hollow cheeks and stringy hair. Mike could sense the intensity of that stare even from 50 yards away. His skin crawled. In an attempt to dispel the sensation, he hurriedly completed his tasks and got back into his taxi. He looked in his mirrors as he left the truck stop and turned back onto I-25 heading north. He was being followed by the white automobile. Mike initially convinced himself that it was simply coincidental. Perhaps the man was also going north. However, the sedan consistently stayed roughly a quarter of a mile behind his trailer as the miles passed. The automobile sped up when Mike did. It also slowed down when he did. The vehicle changed lanes when he did. The headlights in his reflection seemed to loom large and ominous all the time. Approximately 3 o'clock a.m., Mike made the decision to investigate his suspicions. He circled around the deserted streets of Santa Rosa, a small town, before returning to the freeway. His precise path was followed by the white sedan, which never drew nearer or retreated. Mike's hands on the steering wheel started to perspire. This was no accident. He was being purposefully stalked. There was tremendous psychological pressure. Those headlights were there every time Mike looked in his mirrors, staring at him like eyes in the dark. He attempted to use his CV radio to phone other truckers, but few drivers were awake and talkative due to the late hour. The loneliness was debilitating. The pursuit went on with mechanical precision, mile after mile, hour after hour. The driver's actions made it even more horrifying. Typical stalkers may attempt to pass, make menacing gestures, or make contact of some sort. None of stuff was done by this individual. With the patience of a predator, they merely followed, keeping that precise distance, never faltering, never revealing their intentions. The ambiguity was frustrating. The possibilities rushed through Mike's head. Was this a truck driver targeting serial killer? Had he heard tales of highway murderers who preyed on lonesome motorists? Was he going to be robbed at a gas station? Or was it worse than that? This could be the start of a complex multi-vehicle trap. By 4 a.m., Mike was struggling with panic. His coffee was chilly. Static crackled on his radio, and like luminous eyeballs, those headlights stayed glued to his mirrors. He thought of phoning 911, but what would he say to them? That he was on a public roadway with someone driving behind him. Police dealt with actual crimes rather than traffic-frightened paranoid truckers. Then something was different. The vehicle started to get closer as they got closer to the Colorado border. It approached Mike's trailer slowly and deliberately. A 4-mile change to 500. then 300, then 200 yards. Mike felt his heart pounding in his chest. Why did the stalker suddenly stop keeping a proper distance after hours of getting nearer? When Mike noticed a rest area up ahead, he knew the answer. He saw the white automobile take the off-ramp and vanish into the night in his mirror as he passed the exit. Mike felt a surge of physical relief wash over him. The nightmare was finished. It wasn't over, though. Mike was operating the identical Phoenix 3 weeks later, path to Denver. The same section of I-25, but with a different load and night, around 2:30 a.m. In his mirrors he saw a familiar scene just south of Albuquerque. The same meticulous stalking conduct, the same hollow-faced driver, and the same exact quarter-mile distance were all displayed by a white vehicle. Mike was prepared now. He had 911 on speed dial and his phone charged. Once more, though, the car followed 4 hours without posing any threat, vanished at the Colorado border, and Mike began to doubt his own sanity. What kind of person followed random truck drivers all night long? What was the purpose? A month later, the third confrontation took place. Same white vehicle, same time, same route. Mike had done his homework by now. He had posted on trucking forums, gotten in touch with other drivers, and even called state police. He was completely chilled by what he found. There were other victims besides Mike. At least 7 additional truck drivers reported being trailed by a white automobile on I-25 through New Mexico during the 2017 and 2018 period. The same section of highway every time, invariably between 2 a.m. and 6 in the morning. Constantly the same pattern of conduct, meticulous following, flawless distance keeping, and disappearance at the Colorado border. However, there was more. Following their interactions, two drivers said they had learned their personal information. Someone had done the investigation and collated the names of family members, home addresses, and work schedules. Evidence of someone spying his house was discovered by one driver. His wife had been followed to work. Another found out. The ramifications were horrifying. This wasn't just any harassment on the highway. The highway was being used by someone to find and investigate possible victims. The patient's hours following was more than just mental anguish. They were reconnaissance. The stalker was picking up habits, routines, and routes, constructing records on lone drivers who followed recognizable routes throughout desolate terrain. The identity of the driver of the white vehicle remained unknown to Mike. The stalker was never apprehended, even after being reported to several law enforcement authorities. In late 2018, the encounters ceased as strangely as they had started. Perhaps the individual went to a new hunting area. In another state, they might have escalated to more serious offenses. Or perhaps they are still searching for their next victim while driving down shadowy routes. Mike was irrevocably altered by the encounter. He never takes the same route twice, carries pepper spray, and has several dash cams installed. Every time he sees headlights, his pulse quickens, and he obsessively checks his mirrors, keeping constant distance behind him. What happened to Mike isn't the most terrifying aspect. It's what could have occurred to drivers who weren't as cautious, fortunate, or ready. Predators have countless opportunities to prey amid the wide emptiness of the American highway system, where cell coverage is sporadic and assistance can be hours away. Thousands of truck drivers drive alone across dark interstates every night, leaving them open to attack by anyone who is twisted enough to turn the highway system into their own hunting field. Real monsters aren't supernatural, as Mike's story serves as a reminder. They are people. They have patience. They are currently waiting in the shadows between cities, anticipating their next chance to transform a person's everyday drive into a nightmare that will follow them for the rest of their lives. To the frequency that should never be found after 12 years of transporting freight throughout the Midwest, Tommy Rodriguez found the frequency that revolutionized his life. In January 2019, A severe snowfall closed majority of Interstate 70 during an especially harsh winter drive from Chicago to Kansas City. Tommy was one of the few insane drivers who continued to roll through the whiteout. Other truckers were warning him over his CB radio about impassable roads and jackknife semis up ahead. Approximately 3 in the morning, Tommy's CB is located in a remote area of Missouri, began to misbehave. There was an unsettling calm that appeared to press against his eardrums as the normal noise from other drivers turned to static. In an attempt to find a clear channel, he tinkled with the dial until he came across something that chilled him to the bone. Initially, the sound was reminiscent of children singing, a gentle, eerie tune that seemed to float over the static like voices from another planet. Tommy, however, became increasingly aware that it wasn't singing as he listened more intently. It was in tears, children's voices, all crying in perfect harmony. Tommy had to stop and see whether there were genuine children in his taxi, since the sound was so terrible and lifelike. The sobbing lasted precisely 3 minutes before coming to an abrupt halt. Silence was worse than what came next. The sound was that of breathing, steady, deliberate breathing that, despite the fact that Tommy's heater was on, seemed to fog up his windshield from the inside. Running at maximum speed. A visible cloud of condensation formed with each exhale, spelling words. The words "help, US," flashed on the passenger side window before disappearing. To record what was happening, Tommy reached for his phone, but it was dead, nor low battery, as though something had immediately depleted all of its power. His cab's temperature plummeted so quickly that he could see his own breath blending with the enigmatic condensation on the windows, and his dashboard electronics started to flicker. The radio's breathing sounds became more intense and louder. Tommy heard what sounded like scratching coming from inside his speakers, like fingernails tearing at them. The whispers followed. A terrible chorus of pleas was produced by dozens of little voices speaking simultaneously. "Don't abandon us. It's freezing. We are unable to locate our home. Kindly, sir, please assist us." Tommy was so frantic to change the frequency and stop the radio that his hands trembled as he went for the dial. However, the voices followed him. Regardless of the channel he chose, somehow, they were ingrained in his radio system, becoming more powerful and distinct every minute. The kids talked of becoming lost in the snow and being stuck in a place that was constantly winter, dark, and cold. A young girl who couldn't have been older than 7 years old started talking to Tommy directly. She was aware of his name, that he drove a truck, and that he was by himself on the freeway. She informed him about the other kids, dozens of them, whose bodies were never discovered, who had been lost in blizzards over the years, and who were still lost in a never-ending winter, searching for aid that never arrived. In Tommy's cab, the temperature kept decreasing. On the inside of his windows, ice started to build, producing complex designs that uncannily resembled small handprints. He exhaled invisible puffs that hung in the air longer than they should have, producing little face-like figures before vanishing. The young girl's voice then became frantic and frightened. There was more in the static between them, she said. Tommy. Something that pursued the missing kids. Something that fueled their panic and anxiety. Before the radio noticed him, she pleaded with him to switch it off. Before it became aware that someone was actually listening to their frequency. Tommy, however, was immobile. He was drawn more into their frozen world by the mesmerizing whispers. Through his frosted windshield, he could practically see them. Tiny people trudging amid unending mounds of snow, the cold blasted from their lips. A terrible sense of despondency was reflected in their eyes. With fingertips that resembled icicles, they groped for his truck, begging for warmth, for help, for someone to notice them. The radio began to scratch violently, as though something with claws was attempting to rip itself from the speakers. The children's cries turned into terrified screams, alerting Tommy to the fact that the hunter had located them and was pursuing him as well. In spiderweb patterns, the ice on his windows started to shatter. Tommy could swear he saw bright eyes observing him from the storm outside through the fissures. The engine of his pickup died out of the blue. The lights all went out. The wind roaring and the frightened wailing of phantom children were the only sounds. In the complete gloom of Tommy felt the temperature drop even further in his cab. His cheeks, toes, and fingertips all became numb. He was stuck in an unimaginable cold that existed between radio frequencies, freezing to death in his own truck. The little girl's voice, no more than a whisper, broke through the confusion one last time. "Don't allow it to get to you. Switch off the radio. Save yourself." Tommy grabbed the CB radio with all his remaining might and tore the power line out of its socket. Everything ceased when the link was lost. The temperature returned to normal quickly. He roared back to life with his engine. His dispatcher asked him why he hadn't checked in as his phone flashed on, displaying scores of missed calls. Tommy didn't stop and continued driving all the way to Kansas City. However, the encounter had fundamentally altered him. He was unable to jar the sound of those kids' voices. He was unable to forget the sensation of unnatural cold that had almost killed him. Worse, he started looking into cases of missing children along his regular travels and found a disturbing trend. In the Midwest, winter storms have claimed the lives of over 30 children in the last 50 years. Their remains were never found. Eventually, their cases were closed, leaving their families with nothing but sorrow and unanswered questions. The disappearances invariably occurred during the greatest blizzards, when rescue attempts were difficult and visibility was at nil. In order to study the faces of missing children whose cases went back decades, Tommy began keeping copies of missing person flyers in his taxi. His CB radio would occasionally crackle with static, and he would hear the echoes of familiar voices on deserted highways late at night. The same kids who had talked to him that frightful Missouri night. Never again did he tune to that frequency. He didn't have to, though. Even so, the voices reached him, whispering through his radio in the deadliest hours of the night, reminding him that scores of lost souls were still calling for aid that would never arrive somewhere in the static between stations, stuck in an endless winter. Even though Tommy stopped working long-distance trucking 6 months later, he still gets up in the middle of the night occasionally, hears kids sobbing, and feels ice crystals accumulating on the windows of his bedroom. He is aware that the frequency is still in use, just waiting for a winter storm to happen, and the next lonesome motorist to discover it. And he is aware that those lost kids may eventually manage to entice someone else into their icy realm, where the cold never goes away and the snow never stops falling. 3. The non-existent mile marker. Danny Walsh believed he knew every inch of the Interstate 80 between Sacramento and Reno. For 8 years, he had been transporting vegetables from the Central Valley of California to the casinos and dining establishments in Nevada twice a week. He knew the freeway as well as his own driveway. Every bend, slope, every mile sign that separates the desert from the Pacific shore. He was therefore deeply shaken by what transpired on a misty October night in 2020. Around 2 in the morning, it began, when Danny was ascending the mountains of the Sierra Nevada. There was only around 20 feet of vision in front of his headlights due to a dense fog that had swept in. It was the type of soup that caused seasoned drivers to slow down to a crawl and hope they didn't hit someone who had stopped in the street. At around 25, Danny was creeping along with his hazard lights blazing when he noticed the mile marker, mile 187. The issue was that this section of I-80 did not have mile 187. Danny was well versed in the system of numbers. Just before the Cisco Grove exit was mile 186. Additionally, the Soda Springs turnoff was close to mile 188. Mile 187 did not exist. Mile 187 had never existed, but there it was, standing precisely where it shouldn't have been, shining white in his headlights. Squinting through the fog to make sure he wasn't seeing things, Danny slowed down even further. The sign has the same appearance as all the other freeway mile markers. The reflective coating, white text, and green background were all the same, but it indicated a mile that seemed unreal. Something changed when Danny crossed the impossible marker. Around his truck, the fog appeared to get thicker until his headlights could hardly see 5 feet in front of them. It sounded muffled and far away, as though he were driving underwater. The usual sounds of the highway, the rumble of his diesel engine, and the thud of his tires on asphalt. Then he caught sight of the hitchhiker. In the swirling fog, a person stood on the shoulder, thumb out, utterly still. As he went by, Denny's beam brushed across the individual, but the fog rendered any details tough to see. A hazy human form that appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Danny had seen many hitchhikers in her 8 years of night driving, but none who waited by the side of the road, so motionless as a statue. He observed another one a quarter of a mile later. The same position, the same strange motionlessness, the same ability to absorb light. Then one more, and one more. Before long, Danny was passing hitchhikers every few hundred yards. They were all the same in their still position and similarly undetectable, but for their simple human likeness. The fog started to manipulate perspective and distance. After reaching the impossibly high mile 187, Danny felt as though he had been driving 4 hours, but his odometer indicated that he had just traveled 3 miles. The road appeared to go on forever. With every turn, more fog, more hitchhikers, and more unreal geography revealed. His CB radio died after crackling with static. Even his truck's integrated navigation system was perplexed, flashing question marks where the highway number should have been, and his GPS displayed a blank screen with the statement, "Location not found." It appeared as though he had driven into an area that lay between the official mile markers, off the border of the known globe. The hitchhikers started to evolve. As Danny passed, they began to turn their heads to follow his truck, rather than remain still. Through the fog, he was unable to see their faces, but he could sense their focus on him, his fingers against his back. As his headlights drew closer, a few of them moved toward the road, perhaps debating whether to walk straight into his path. Danny attempted to radio for assistance, alternating between emergency and CB frequencies, but each channel yielded the same outcome. Only sporadic bursts of static, which sounded unsettlingly like muttered whispers, broke the dead silence. Dead silence. The tone was clearly urgent, but the sentences were too warped to make sense, as if dozens of individuals were trying to alert him to the imminence of something horrible. Mile 187. 5 showed up in his headlights. Next, mile 187. 7. Next, mile 187. 9. With increasing fear, Danny recognized that he was stuck in a single mile of highway that had somehow been extended into an interminable loop. It seemed as though distance itself had become odd and stretchy. As the mile signs were ticking up in fractions, they were becoming more daring hitchhikers. Danny had to swerve around several of them because they were now standing right on the middle line. Despite the speed of his truck, others strolled beside it, keeping up. Over the sound of the engines, their footsteps could be heard somehow. Danny noticed them as he checked his mirrors. A gathering parade of dark shapes arose and vanished into the fog, trailing behind his trailer. Mile 187. 9. Hundreds of them were present. They faced Dee's truck and were completely silent as they lined both sides of the roadway like paragoers. Danny had to rely solely on the reflective lane markers, which appeared to glow with their own internal light, to navigate the road surface because the fog had grown so dense. Then he saw the actual mile 100, 888, precisely where every map and GPS system in the world indicates it should be. Just like a curtain being drawn back, the fog abruptly lifted as Danny's headlights struck the well-known marking. In an instant, the hitchhikers disappeared, leaving no evidence of their presence. His radio came back to life with the usual buzz of the roadway. His precise location on I-80 between Cisco Grove and Soda Springs was displayed when his GPS revived. After pulling into the next truck stop, Danny checked for 20 minutes. His watch, his odometer, and his record books. Every instrument in his truck indicated that he had traveled precisely 1 mile between markers 187 and 188. At a slower speed, the drive had taken exactly 2 minutes and 37 seconds, which is standard time for that section of roadway. However, Danny was aware that he had encountered an impossibility. He had been stranded in a mile of road that was technically non-existent for what seemed like hours. Encircled by people who shouldn't be there, it felt unnatural to drive through such dense fog. When he arrived home, he looked into the area, searching for any historical oddities, accidents, or disappearances that would explain what he had experienced. More than the event itself, what he discovered chilled him. On the particular section of I-80, 7 drivers had experienced similar events in the previous 30 years. Always in the midst of dense fog, always with impractical mile markings, and enigmatic hitchhikers who never stop for more than a mile before heading back to the regular highway. 3 of the drivers were completely gone. Their trucks were discovered with their engines still running at rest areas or truck stops. According to logbooks, they had just stopped in the middle of their journey for no apparent reason. As though they had left their lives behind and disappeared into the mists, the drivers were never seen again. Danny continues to drive the I-80, but when the weather forecast predicts fog in the mountains, it chooses an alternative path. Late at night, he has overheard other truckers discussing Mile 187 on the CB radio. There have been tales of vehicles becoming lost between the markers, picking up non-human hitchhikers and finding themselves stuck on the same mile again and over again until they either escaped or joined whatever was haunting that unreachable section of the highway. Danny occasionally believes he can still make out the stars in his peripheral vision on clear nights when they are brilliant and the road is deserted. Figures waiting the side of the road, thumbs out, patiently waiting for the next motorist to lose their way in the fog and find the mile marker that appears just when you need it most but isn't marked on any official map. For the rest stop that feeds at night, during his 15-year career, Jake Morrison had hauled freight across the nation, pulling into thousands of truck stops, but he had never seen one like Sunset Ridge Travel Plaza. He saw it in his headlights at about 3 in the morning, on a night without the moon in rural Nebraska, a vast fuel parking lots, pumps, and a main structure that appeared much too big for such a barren section of I-80. Jake was initially taken aback by how flawless everything appeared. The majority of truck stops displayed their age. Weeds sprouting through the asphalt, neon signs that flicker, and cracked pavement. Sunset Ridge, however, seems to have been constructed just yesterday. The parking area was immaculate. The facade of the structure was illuminated by strategically placed floodlights. Even the fuel pumps, with their throwback 1980s style, looked brand new. Jake parked his trailer into an empty parking spot next to the building so he could get some gasoline and take a restroom break. Then he saw something strange. There were no other cars in sight, even though the truck stop was spotless and well lit. There are only vacant spaces extending in all ways beneath those to bright lights, no automobiles, trucks, or motorcycles, lights. As Jake got closer, the glass doors of the main structure opened automatically, setting out a happy electronic chime. His complexion appeared pale and sickly as fluorescent lights pulsed overhead, illuminating everything in a harsh white glow. It was a standard arrangement. There are game machines, a hot food counter, rows of snacks and beverages, and a tiny dining area with plastic tables and chairs. However, something incorrect with the goods. As he scanned the shelves in the snack aisle, Jake saw that, although everything appeared regular from a distance, the details were all incorrect. Although the candy bar's brand names were well known, the typography was a little strange. Kit Kat with 2 T's and Sneakers in place of Snickers. The logos on the soda cans were quite similar to those of Pepsi and Coca-Cola. A clerk at the counter grinned too broadly when Jake walked up to him. Despite the late hour, the man's uniform appeared pressed and starched, and his grey hair was neatly combed, giving the impression that he was in his 50s. His eyes were all dark, yet his name tag said Harold in friendly letters. The whole viewable area, not just the pupils, as if peering into 2 shadowy wells. Harold's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a deep hole. "Welcome to Sunset Ridge. What can I get you tonight?" Harold's unwaveringly wide smile faltered as he gestured toward a hallway at the back of the store. "The restrooms are down the hall, past the arcade. Coffee's fresh, made just for you." Jake muttered something about needing to use the restroom and buying some coffee. The hallway was longer than it should have been, stretching back far farther than the building's exterior dimensions would allow, and the walls were lined with old photos in cheap frames. As Jake passed the photographs of truck drivers, families, and tourists, he noticed something unsettling about them. Their eyes were wrong, just like Harold's. They were all black, reflecting the fluorescent lights in the hallway like dark mirrors. The restroom was immaculate, almost surgically sterile. In an attempt to dispel the eerie feeling that had descended upon him since entering the building, Jake splashed water on his face and looked in the mirror. He saw the bathroom door behind him, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw Harold standing there, observing him. But when Jake turned around, the doorway was empty, and Harold was waiting in the main store with a steaming cup of coffee and that same eerie smile. The coffee smelled amazing, rich, and aromatic in a way that made Jake's mouth water. "Drive safely now," Harold murmured as Jake made his way to the exit. "And remember, Sunset Ridge is always here when you need us." He paid with cash despite his mounting discomfort, noting that Harold's fingers were strangely cold when their hands briefly brushed during the transaction. Always waiting, always open. Eager to get some distance from the strange truck stop, Jake got back into his vehicle and drove out from the parking area. After 3 hours, when he pulled into a legitimate truck stop in Iowa for his required rest break, Jake mentioned Sunset Ridge to another driver, describing the strange clerk and the 2 perfect facilities. However, as he merged back onto the interstate, he realized he couldn't remember exactly where the exit had been. He checked his GPS, scrolled through the truck stop directory on his phone, and even pulled up satellite maps of the area. An older man named Carl, the other trucker, became pale. "You entered the house. You're fortunate to be alive, Jesus, son," Carl said, his voice hardly audible above a whisper. Carl shared with Jake the rumors that went around among long-distance truckers, whispered chats on CB radio in the darkest hours of the night. Drivers who stayed too long at these phantom truck stops were never seen again, Carl said. Their trucks would be found abandoned on remote stretches of highway, fuel tanks empty, logbooks showing impossible mileage readings. Stories of truck stops that appeared when drivers were tired, desperate, or lost. Places that appeared perfect on the outside, but were actually something else entirely. Something that fed on travelers who stopped for food, fuel, or rest. The coffee, Carl replied urgently. Security cameras at actual truck stops occasionally captured images of missing truckers following black-eyed clerks into buildings that were larger inside than outside and walking into facilities that didn't exist. Jake's blood froze when he said, "Please tell me you didn't drink the coffee." During his drive to Iowa, he had consumed almost the whole cup of coffee. He had never tasted coffee that rich and flavorful in his life. It was satisfying that he drained it mindlessly. Hours later, he became aware that he felt odd. It's strange, but not exactly sick. Apollo felt as though nothingness had taken the place of something that had been scooped out of him. In the weeks that followed, Jake made an effort to resume his regular schedule. However, the experience at Sunset Ridge had altered him in ways he was unable to describe. Food didn't taste well. There was no rest in sleep. No matter how much he ate, he was never able to quench his insatiable need. The worst part was that he had to look for the truck stop on every night run, looking for that ideal parking space, a nose to bright lights on the horizon. Drivers started to steer clear of Jake. They claimed he appeared off in some way, paler despite spending his days in the sun, slimmer despite eating continuously, and his eyes had taken on an odd appearance that unnerved people. Jake recognized their terror when he saw his image in the truck stop mirrors. It seemed as though something was gradually eating away at the edges of his eyes, making them darker. Every night the yearning got stronger. In order to reach a truck stop that existed somewhere between the official highway maps and the shadowy areas that hungry things called home, Jake would frequently find himself taking detours along unknown roads and following vaguely remembered exit signs. When he eventually located Sunset Ridge once more, he realized that would locate it, as it was now beckoning to him. Harold would be ready with another cup of exquisite coffee and that big smile. 3 months later, Jake's truck was discovered on a desolate section of the Nebraska highway. Despite being filled only hours before, the fuel tank is inexplicably empty, and the engine is still running. He had traveled 847 miles at night, according to his logbook, but according to his GPS, he had never left the truck stop where he had begun his shift. Security cameras saw Jake entering what looked to be a truck stop, a brightly lit structure. The coffee counter gleamed like a shrine under fluorescent lights, and they followed a man in a pressed uniform. 60 seconds later, the skyscraper disappeared from the video, leaving behind Jake's abandoned truck's distant glow and an empty highway. Even so, drivers continue to claim seeing Sunset Ridge on moonless evenings when the highway seems to go on forever. The fuel gauge is empty, and the urge for coffee is too great to ignore. The two brilliant lights, the immaculate parking lot, Harold behind the desk with his black eyes, and waiting patiently for the next traveler who needs to halt, wearing an impossible smile. Just a little while, just a cup of coffee, just long enough to feed the creature that inhabits the gaps between actual locations and creates truck stops when hungry drivers most need them. 5. The load that whispers back. Over the course of his 20-year trucking career, Rick Martinez has transported everything: furniture, cattle, electronics, and even dangerous commodities that needed specific route and licenses. However, on a chilly March night in 2021, he picked up goods from an unremarkable facility in Detroit that was unlike anything he had ever hauled. It was simply identified on the shipment manifest as medical equipment headed to an Atlanta research institution. The fact that the equipment was still in use was not mentioned. The warehouse was situated in an industrial area that, even in the daytime, appeared deserted. The sole sound was the distant rumbling of interstate traffic, and strange shadows were thrown between deserted buildings by broken streetlights. At the loading dock, Rick backed his trailer up to 2 men in surgical. There was a single enormous crate waiting, along with rubber gloves and masks, easily 8 feet long, 4 feet broad, and 3 feet deep. The crate was enormous. It was constructed of sturdy steel, had several caution labels emblazoned on it, and reinforced corners. This side up, fragile, only to be transported in a refrigerator, and, most dangerously, never open. Before Rick could raise any questions, the men silently locked it in his trailer, gave him the paperwork, and vanished back into the warehouse. Rick observed that although his trailer was only hauling 1 crate, it felt heavier than normal as he drew away from the loading dock. The weight distribution appeared strange, as though the cargo was changing back there, and his truck strained to accelerate. However, he noticed that the crate was securely fastened with sturdy straps, and had not moved when he looked in his mirrors. About an hour into the drive, the first indication that something was amiss appeared. While driving south on I-75, Rick heard a noise coming from his trailer that frightened him. Like fingernails dragging over metal, there was a faint scratching sound. At the next rest stop, he stopped and went around to inspect his load, but everything appeared to be in order. Straps taut, warning labels still securely affixed. The carton sat just where the warehouse staff had placed it. Rick attempted to tell himself back in his cab that it was only the sounds of a truck getting used to the rhythm of the roadway. However, as the miles passed, the scratching became more relentless and louder. A pattern emerged. After 3 brief scrapes, there is a break, followed by 3 additional scratches, similar to someone inside the container hammering out a distress signal. Something terrible joined the clawing about midnight. Whispers. Rick initially assumed it was simply the wind blowing through the openings in his trailer doors. However, he was able to discern true words when he switched off his radio and paid attention. A disconcerting chorus of pleas and warnings seemed to come from the steel crate as muffled voices speaking in what seemed like various languages spoke simultaneously. Rick called the number on his shipping manifest as he stopped into a truck stop outside of Cincinnati. The connection was cut off. He made use of the backup contact, one more dead number. He even checked up the address of the Atlanta Research Center online and found it to be a fake. He was transporting an unidentified load for an apparently non-existent corporation to an imaginary location. The trailer's voices became louder. Rick could hear them plainly now through the back wall of the cab. He sat in the truck stop parking lot, trying to think of what to do. Dozens of voices in anxious, terrified tones. Speaking English, some begged for assistance, requesting to be released, and describing an endless darkness. There were others who spoke languages Rick didn't recognize, but there was a unifying anguish. In their voices, a young woman with a southern accent that made Rick think of his own daughter broke through the confusion with a single voice. She pleaded with him to open the crate and explained that she had been imprisoned inside for so long that she had forgotten what sunshine looked like. She talked about being taken, fled a hospital after being informed that she was a participant in a medical study, waking up in the darkness among other people who had been duped in the same way. Rick pondered his options, his hands shaking. He felt compelled to call the police. What would he tell them, though? That he could hear voices coming from inside a locked medical container, that his cargo was speaking to him. They would assume he was experiencing a breakdown, or that he was hallucinating from too much travel. Over the course of the night, the voices grew more adamant. Rick was informed of the other people that attempted to take them. Drivers who eventually opened the crate after going crazy listening to the incessant cry for assistance discovered something much worse than they had anticipated. The voices informed him of the research center, detailed unethical tests, and described methods that left people conscious but unable to move or scream. Rick's heater was operating at full capacity, yet the temperature inside his cab started to decrease. His windows developed patterns of frost that resembled unsettling handprints on glass. It seemed as though whatever was keeping them from the outside world was eroding as the voices became more vivid and clear. Individual stories were now audible to Rick. One of the construction workers had been involved in an accident, a homeless woman who believed she was receiving free medical care, a college student who had offered to participate in what appeared to be a standard study. By daybreak, Rick was at his breaking point. All night long, the voices had been speaking to him, identifying themselves, sharing their tales, and pleading with him to release them from whatever nightmare they had been imprisoned in. Determined to find out what was actually inside the crate, he pulled into an abandoned truck stop and used a crowbar to walk back to his trailer. The heavy-duty lock was easily removed using Rick's crowbar. The voices ceased abruptly as the steel lid groaned open. The only sound in the trailer was Rick's own frightened breathing. And then there was total quiet. A thick coating of dry ice formed within the crate, obscuring his eyesight with clouds of mist. Rick noticed what appeared to be medical equipment. When the fog lifted, cables, tubes, life support systems, and monitoring equipment. However, the apparatus was linked to something that sent shivers down Rick's spine. Dozens of human figures, suspended in a preservation fluid of some sort. They were unaware that their bodies were linked to technology that kept them alive. Their limbs were arranged as though they had been attempting to claw their way out when the preservation process started. Their eyes were wide but vacant, and their lips were locked in wordless cries. With shaking hands, Rick secured the crate and slammed it shut as he staggered backward. He could still hear them, though, something else, not the preserved bodies. Something that had been speaking to him with their voices, in order to trick him into opening their prison. Whatever intellect was within that container had been posing as the victims and imitating their cries for assistance. That's when the genuine voices began, unnatural noises that appeared to originate from the gaps between the bodies, claiming to show Rick things that would help him comprehend and make him want to join them in their preserved paradise. They were hungry whispers. Despite its weight, the crate started to sway back and forth, the strap straining against something trying to escape from inside. Talking about voices in his trailer and unlawful medical experiments, Rick drove straight to the closest police station and surrendered himself in. The officers discovered just what the manifest had promised when they opened the package. Transporting real medical equipment to an Atlanta research facility. Surgical equipment, heart monitors, and brain scanners are all accurately recorded and accounted for. However, Rick was aware of what he had heard and seen. In whatever mental hospital he is currently staying in, the voices continue to whisper to him occasionally late at night when he is attempting to fall asleep. They inform him about the other people who are out there being carried in identical cages while they cry out for unanswered help. They tell him that he could have joined them, could have stopped the awful weight of consciousness that comes with being alive and cognizant, and could have found peace in their preserved darkness. Similar occurrences are also being reported by other truckers, shipments that appear to have a conscience of their own, loads that mutter, and freight that begs for liberation. The majority of drivers learn to arrive on time. Their radios, while disregarding the noises coming from their trailers. However, some people are unable to ignore the whispers and cannot stop themselves from looking at what they are actually carrying. Through the night, they find their trucks abandoned on isolated highways. Except for typical cargo and the lingering odor of preservative chemicals, trailers are empty. The voices are still there, moving around the highways in unmarked containers, calling to drivers who are inquisitive enough to listen, lonely enough, or exhausted enough. They guarantee answers to queries you were unaware you had. Provide glimmers of a world outside the realm of everyday human existence. Simply open the package to see what's actually inside. You just need to pay attention as the cargo begins to respond in whispers. 6. The mirrors that show too much. In his 18 years of vehicle mirror adjustment, Bobby Fletcher had never seen anything like what transpired. In November 2019, he ran from Portland to Phoenix at a dubious truck repair shop outside of Bakersfield. It began with a straightforward side mirror replacement, the kind of store that didn't ask too many questions about how you paid for them or where you obtained your parts, and that remained open all night. Bobby was anxious on busy highways since the previous mirror had been bouncing free for weeks, causing blind spots. Despite the late hour, he drove in when he saw Midnight Auto Repair gleaming under flickering neon signs. He was met by the mechanic, a thin, oily man with yellowed teeth who called himself Pete. He promised to get Bobby back on the road in an hour and gave a reasonable cost for the mirror replacement. In the intense glare of floodlights, Pete worked swiftly to remove Bobby's damaged mirror and install what appeared to be a regular replacement. However, as soon as Bobby got back into his taxi and adjusted the new mirror, he saw that something was off. The reflection was too crisp and clear. revealing details that shouldn't have been visible in the dim parking lot of the repair shop. Bobby observed that the mirror appeared to reflect more than it should when he turned back onto Highway 99. The new mirror showed things that weren't there or shouldn't have been there, while his other mirrors displayed the expected image of his trailer and the road behind him. In shadows where there should be no movement, he saw glimmers of movement, almost human-looking forms that moved in ways that defied physics were seen darting between other cars. Bobby initially persuaded himself that it was simply the trickery of his weary eyes. Long-distance drivers were infamous for Bobby had been driving for 14 hours straight and was experiencing hallucinations as a result of driving too much. However, the images in the mirror became unavoidable as the night went on. Bobby started to see what was going on inside other cars in the mirror. The automobile was moving at perfect speed and staying in its lane. But when he passed a sedan on a dark stretch of highway, the driver was slumped over the steering wheel, blood flowing from a head wound, visible in the mirror. Bobby saw the driver of the car with his own eyes, and he seemed completely normal, attentive, and in good health. He saw a family in an SUV in the mirror a few miles later. Bobby saw them screaming in fear, their jaws agape, their eyes reflecting some horror, rather than the typical scene of parents and kids on a road trip. But if he looked straight at the SUV, he could see through the windows that the family was sleeping soundly, the kids contentedly in their car seats. The hidden reality that existed in parallel to the everyday world was being revealed to Bobby by the mirror. Each car he passed held horrors, tragedies, or secrets that were hidden from view, but were glaringly obvious in the damned mirror. When Bobby checked his own trailer in the mirror, the worst realization occurred. In the mirror, he saw dozens of pallid individuals clinging to the outside of his truck rather than his load of appliances and furnishings. Like someone who had attempted to twist clay into human form without knowing the correct proportions, they had extended limbs and faces that were nearly human but stretched incorrectly. Their jaws twitched continuously as though they were attempting to convey an urgent message, and their eyes were pure black. After stopping at the next rest stop, Bobby strolled around his trailer with trembling hands and a flashlight. Everything appeared to be typical. His usual cargo load was fastened with ties and regulation straps. There were no figures or irregularities, however. The ghostly creatures were still there, still hanging to his vehicle, still attempting to communicate with him as he went back to his cab and looked in the mirror. Their inaudible voices, the images in the mirror grew increasingly agitated as the night wore on. They appeared to be alerting Bobby of an impending danger as they hurriedly motioned at other cars, as though they were attempting to get him ready for some horrible incident that only they could see coming. Their movements and wordless cries grew increasingly desperate. Bobby started seeing glimmers of the future in the mirror. His own vehicle was jackknifed across several lanes of roadway, observed flashing emergency cars, and witnessed the loading of corpse bags into ambulances. The pictures were short, but incredibly detailed. Even the precise location of the sun in the sky, along with identifiable landmarks and mile markers, suggested that these events would take place at dawn. Bobby attempted to cover the mirror with a towel, but the cloth seemed to be translucent, allowing him to see through it. No matter how many times he tried to move the mirror to point away from the road, it kept going back to its previous position. The damned mirror had grown obsessed with revealing to him things he didn't want to see, facts he wasn't supposed to be aware of. When Bobby got closer to the precise spot he'd seen in his future visions, the pale beings became increasingly agitated. They put their faces against what appeared to be an imperceptible wall separating their world from his, pointed forward, and made frenzied gestures. Bobby could see in the mirror that the highway ahead was strewn with debris, twisted metal strewn about, freight and emergency personnel who moved in slow, methodical steps, as if they were handling a large number of casualties. However, everything seemed normal when Bobby glanced at the same section of road through his windshield. Traffic moved well in the early morning. There were no indications of a collision, and the pavement was clear. He was seeing a future tragedy in the mirror, one that had not yet occurred, but was nonetheless unavoidably coming. Bobby's CB only generated static when he attempted to radio other truckers to alert them to possible dangers up ahead. Even though he was in an area with typically good coverage, his phone did not display any signal when he tried to call 911 to report a potential accident. More furiously, the ghostly images in the mirror pointed at his driving wheel as if to compel him to do something. Bobby became aware of the terrible reality as morning drew near. He was seeing more than simply the future in the mirror. It was demonstrating his part in its creation. In the next several minutes, he would make decisions that would lead to the accident he had witnessed. The pallid people weren't making an effort to alert him to the tragedy of another person. They were attempting to keep him from becoming the reason behind it. As other cars drove past, Bobby parked his pickup on the shoulder and sat there. Their drivers were not aware of the impending disaster. He could see the pallid forms in the mirror nodding in agreement, their frenetic movements relaxing to soft words of encouragement. Bobby had somehow chosen not to continue by declining to participate in the predestined disaster, altered the future he had seen in the mirror. But he was not the only victim of the mirror's curse. The reflection started to show Bobby different futures, other catastrophes he might cause or stop. While he sat on the highway shoulder, he imagined that he would be driving through a school zone just as kids would be crossing the roadway. He witnessed the brake on his truck fail, setting off a series of events that would result in the deaths of scores of people. He witnessed every calamity that might arise from his continuous presence on the highway. That morning, after 18 years of truck driving, Bobby left his vehicle and never looked back. 3 days later, the highway patrol located the car. The driver is nowhere to be seen, but the cargo is undamaged and the engine is still going. The replacement mirror had been taken out, leaving no evidence that it had ever been there. Other truck drivers have had experiences with Pete's Midnight Auto Repair, which is consistently located in various areas and consistently provides affordable, speedy repairs. Those that accept his mirror replacements end up seeing things that lie between reflection and reality, as well as potential futures that haven't yet occurred, learning that some information has an unpayable cost and that some facts are too horrible to endure. Across the highway system, the mirrors are still mounted on vehicles, giving drivers a view of parallel worlds to our own. The majority of truck drivers learn to ignore the damned reflections, concentrate on the road ahead, and believe only what their own eyes tell them. However, some people are unable to quit searching for the truth that lies under the surface of everyday reality. Pale figures cling to the outside of automobiles. The future is written in visions too terrible to ignore, and their trucks are discovered abandoned on distant highways with mirrors missing and drivers gone into whatever reality lurks on the other side of reflection. 7. The Way Station that weighs souls. After 12 years of transporting machinery throughout the Midwest, Dave Kowalski believed he knew every way station between Chicago and Denver. Scales from the Department of Transportation were only one aspect of the work. Routine halts at which authorities weighed you, looked through your logbooks, and examined your equipment before allowing you to resume driving. This is why Dave's understanding of the traffic laws was completely upended by what transpired near mile marker 247 on Interstate 80 in Iowa. Around 2 a.m., the way station came into view his headlights. In 2020, on a misty October evening, despite the bad visibility, Dave managed to stay ahead of time while transporting a shipment of industrial equipment from Chicago to Colorado. The computerized sign said, "Entry is required for all trucks," in the well-known orange characters. Dave guided his rig onto the scale platform, downshifting. However, there was an instant issue with this way station. Dave had never seen a dock building that appeared to be decades older. It had a chimney that spewed black smoke into the night sky. Old brick walls and small windows with bars across them, strange symbols, were engraved into the concrete platform around the borders of the enormous scale, which was much larger than was required for weighing trucks. Out of the structure came a figure dressed in what appeared to be a dot uniform, but the clothes were outdated, as though they had been made in the 1950s. The tall, thin inspector had pale skin and eyes that gleamed like an animal in the floodlights of the station. Evening driver, Morrison's name badge said, Inspector Morrison, but the letters seemed to shift and blur whenever Dave tried to focus on them, said in a voice that had an odd echo, as though he was speaking from a deep hole. Please exit your car so we can assess it. Tonight, we must inspect more than just your cargo. With documents in hand, Dave hopped out of his taxi. However, Morrison showed no interest in his bills of lights or logbooks. As an alternative, the inspector circled Dave's truck cautiously, tracing the surface of the trailer with his fingers and occasionally pushing his ear against as though listening for something within the metal. Morrison checked a clipboard that appeared to be covered in text Dave couldn't quite read and stated, Your cargo weight looks fine. We must measure something else, though. Please get on the platform. Morrison pointed to a narrow strip of the scale platform that had been painted white. Dave paused. No inspector had ever asked him to stand on the scales himself in his 12 years of truck driving, but Morrison's pale eyes possessed a power that appeared to demand compliance. Dave then entered the assigned space. Incomprehensible figures flickered on the digital readout, not pounds or tons, but odd figures that seemed to change and evolve while Dave watched. Dave could see no graphite touching the paper, but Morrison scowled and checked his clipboard, making notes with a pencil that left marks. Interesting, said Morrison softly. Morrison led Dave into the way station building, which was much larger inside than its exterior dimensions should have allowed, and the interior appeared to be a hybrid of an old-fashioned medical examination room and a government office. You're carrying more than your manifest indicates. Much more, Morrison said. Sit here, please, Morrison urged, pointing to a chair in front of what appeared to be a huge balancing scale, with filing cabinets full of manila folders, examination tables covered in white sheets, and strange equipment that hummed and clicked. In the shadows, the traditional type, where two plates are hung from a central beam. However, the left plate contained items Dave was unable to identify in place of weights on one side, objects that changed color and appeared to absorb light instead of reflect it. Morrison started posing queries that were unrelated to trucking laws. He was curious about Dave's early years, romances, frustrations, and regrets. The items on the scale appeared to get heavier with each response, and that side of the balance sank lower while Morrison jotted down more notes on his enigmatic clipboard. With a start, Morrison remarked, Tell me about the accident in Milwaukee. Dave felt his blood freeze. It had been 8 years since the catastrophe. An inattentional moment, he would run a red light. Someone who happened to be in the crosswalk at the wrong time. No charges had ever been brought against Dave. Everything had been covered by the insurance. Additionally, the tragedy was formally categorized as inevitable. Dave, however, was aware of the reality. He had been too exhausted and preoccupied to meet the delivery date. Dave lied. I have no idea what you're talking about. With a smile, Morrison flashed teeth that appeared much too sharp for human teeth. Mr. Kowalski, the scale is honest. You're bearing the burden of that man's passing, the shame of never coming clean, and the guilt of the family you wrecked. That's a lot of weight for one vehicle to carry. The scale of balance tilted even more, and Dave's reflection was seen in the shadowy items on the left plate. His mirror, however, was off. He was older, more gaunt, and had hollow eyes that revealed sorrow and shame that he had spent years trying to hide. Without any of the stories he told himself about that night in Milwaukee, the picture captured him for what he truly was. Morrison persisted in questioning Dave about other instances he had made an effort to forget. The time he almost struck a school bus while driving under the influence. When his vehicle broke down, he left a shipment of medication behind, knowing that sick people would be left without their prescription drugs. In order to falsify his logbooks, he had accepted bribes. He had misled about the safety inspections. He had disregarded the rules in order to save time and money. The scale tilted farther with each confession, and the shadowy items on the left plate appeared to become more substantial and genuine. They weren't objects, Dave realized. They represented the cumulative weight of all the poor decisions he had ever made, each instance of cowardice and selfishness manifested physically. "You're overweight, far too heavy to continue on the highways," Morrison explained, looking at his clipboard. "We will have to reduce your burden." Morrison unlocked a filing cabinet and took out a thick folder bearing Dave's name. The folder held documents, photos, and what appeared to be medical records from Dave's early years, but it also contained items that shouldn't have been there. "We offer a number of weight loss alternatives," Morrison added. "We can eliminate specific memories. We have records of ideas Dave had never voiced out loud. Memories he tried to conceal, dreams and nightmares that had haunted him in the darkest hours of the night. For example, you might utterly forget about the accident, or we can assign blame to another person. Maybe a relative who has never committed a crime. Complete reorganization of the personality is the most preferred option. Your physique and trucking abilities are retained, but a cleaner, more effective model takes the place of everything else." It became increasingly clear to Dave that this was no ordinary way station. Some sort of supernatural processing was involved. Center where Soul's moral weight was determined and modified. The identities of thousands of drivers who had come through this facility were in the other files in Morrison's cabinet. They are all transporting loads that are too hefty on regular roads. "What would happen if I said no?" Dave inquired. Morrison smiled more broadly, flashing those impossible too sharp teeth. "Your present burden will then continue to grow heavier as you carry it. You will be crushed by the weight of your decisions every day of your life and every mile you drive. The majority of drivers would rather use our services than that substitute." Dave gazed at the balance scale, seeing his image in those shadowy items that contained all of his accumulated shame and sorrow. He considered how relieved he would be to have everything taken away, to drive out of here with no regrets and no recollection of the suffering he had caused. However, something within him resisted the offer. He was a product of those memories, even the bad ones. He was a more cautious driver and a more thoughtful person as a result of his remorse and regret. Removing his errors would also remove the lessons they had imparted to him. Dave responded, "I'll keep my load." At last, Morrison appeared truly taken aback. "Are you sure?" Dave responded, "I'll have to be more careful about what I add to it, because the weight will only get heavier the more mistakes you make, the more lies you tell, the more you hurt other people, and eventually it will destroy you." Morrison made a last note on his clipboard and shrug. "All right, but keep in mind, mister, the scales never close, and the weight never stops accumulating," Dave said, returning to his truck, getting into the cab, and leaving the way station. "Kowalski, we're always here when you change your mind." The facility was gone when he looked in his mirrors, leaving only an empty roadway in his wake. However, Dave sensed a change in his pickup. It was truly heavier today, burdened by the full realization of all the mistakes he had made during his life. The weight never decreased. If anything, it got heavier as Dave became more conscious of the impact his decisions had on other people. However, he also improved as a person and a driver, bearing his burden with the understanding that some burdens are supposed to be carried rather than passed on to others. Similar way stations, which show up on vacant highway segments when drivers are transporting more than just merchandise in their trailers, have been encountered by other truckers. Some take Morrison up on his offer. "I drive away, somewhat lessen yet unburdened. Some, like Dave, decide to keep their loads and deal with the fallout from their decisions. Drivers whose souls have become too heavy for regular highways to support nevertheless see the way station. Morrison keeps working, helping people who are unable to take responsibility for their own misdeeds, but eventually, the scale always balances. Additionally, someone always has to pay the price for the burdens we decide to bear during the night's gloomy hours. 8. The sleeper berth that dreams alone. Marcus Williams purchased the second-hand sleeper berth from a truck salvage yard north of Memphis after 6 years of owning his Peterbilt 379. Before his next long-distance run to Seattle, Marcus needed a replacement berth because the original had been destroyed in a small accident. The unit was sold to him for half the customary amount by the twitchy-handed, anxious salvage yard owner, who appeared eager to get it off his property. The berth appeared it was in good shape, with dark blue drapes, a firm mattress that showed no wear, and a typical size. The proprietor of the salvage yard failed to disclose the origin of the berth or the reason behind the prior owner's decision to tear it from his truck in the middle of the night and insist on its destruction. Within 12 hours, Marcus was back on the road after having the berth fitted at a little rock truck shop. It seemed absolutely normal for him to sleep in the new berth for the first time. He drew the curtains, stopped into a rest area outside of Nashville, and took a seat for his required 8-hour take-a break. Long-haul truckers rarely got the kind of deep, sound sleep that this one provided. However, Marcus sensed something odd when he woke up. Although his truck's clock showed that 3 hours had passed, his logbook revealed he had been asleep for precisely 8 hours. Stranger still, his GPS indicated that he had inadvertently driven 47 miles. While parked at the rest area, Marcus looked at his odometer and fuel gauge. Both attested to the fact that someone had driven his truck while he was asleep. Marcus initially thought there was a problem with the electronics in his truck. Clocks could be impacted by electrical issues, and GPS systems occasionally had glitches. However, the same thing occurred the following evening. When Marcus woke up from a nap at a truck stop in Wyoming, he discovered that his truck had inexplicably moved to a different parking spot, facing the other way from where he had parked. Marcus was horrified by what he saw on the security cameras at the truck stop. According to the video, his truck started up about 3 in the morning, and spending over an hour driving itself around the parking lot. The cameras caught a man behind the steering wheel, and the cab lights were on, but Marcus had been asleep in his berth the whole time. Furthermore, the person operating his truck didn't appear to be very human. The shape's movements were incorrect, but it was around Marcus's size and form. Too precise, too fluid, like unseen strings controlling a puppet. Except for 2 dark holes where eyes should have been, the figure's face was completely featureless when it turned to face the camera. Over the next few evenings, Marcus attempted to remain up, but fatigue finally compelled him to go to sleep. Whenever he made use of the berth, the same thing took place. When he would wake up from an abnormally deep slumber, he would discover that something that looked like him but wasn't him had driven his truck. It appeared to be learning, growing more self-assured every night, traveling more and farther from Marcus's parking spot. During the hours when Marcus should have been resting, other truckers started to describe odd experiences with his vehicle. They claimed to have seen his Peterbilt driven by a driver who waved but never answered CB radio calls on routes where Marcus had no recollection of ever traveling. Some claimed that the person driving appeared off in some way, as though someone had attempted to replicate Marcus' features from a badly taken photo. The corporation started making more ambitious travel plans. In one state, Marcus would go to sleep and wake up to discover that he had spent the night driving hundreds of miles. His fuel usage skyrocketed. Toll road cameras recorded his truck traveling in places Marcus had never been, and his tires displayed odd wear patterns. Even worse, it appeared to be communicating with humans during these trips at night, Strangers thanked Marcus on thank you cards for providing them with roadside assistance in the middle of the night. After a lunch Marcus didn't remember having, a waitress at a diner in Oklahoma called to congratulate him for the huge tip he had left. The personnel at the gas station knew him from past trips that had never occurred. Using Marcus' truck and identity, the creature was leading a parallel existence and forming connections and experiences that Marcus would never recall. Something seemed to have learned to live inside his berth while he was slept, controlling his car and his appearance to explore the world in the hours when Marcus wasn't aware. Marcus attempted to sleep in a motel other than where he was born, but the entity appeared to be more attached to the truck than to him. His Peterbilt, departing parking lots in the middle of the night while being driven by the same faceless person, was caught on camera by hotel security. In order to animate his truck, the creature seemed to be getting stronger, more self-sufficient, and less reliant on Marcus' actual presence. Marcus's installation of a covert camera in his taxi, positioned to record the birth region while he slept, was the turning point. Something inexplicable was shown in the video. A dark reflection of Marcus started to develop on the berth next to him as he slept, initially translucent, resembling smoke molded into a human shape. The replica eventually hardened to resemble Marcus in every way. Then, as Marcus slept on, the duplicate would get out of the berth, turn on the truck, and drive off. What occurred to Marcus while his duplicate was gone, however, was the most terrible aspect. His body was captured on camera as it grew more translucent, eventually disappearing into the dark fabric of the delivery. It wasn't merely a clone of him. It was gradually taking his place, gaining material from his slumber to give it greater life. Marcus became aware that something that resided in the berth and fed on the life essence and dreams of whoever slept there was consuming him. Every night, his replica grew more substantial as he grew slightly less solid. The creature would eventually be finished, and Marcus would completely disappear, leaving just the duplicate to continue living his life and operating his truck. Marcus's investigation into the berth's past validated his worst suspicions. 3 months before to Marcus purchasing the berth, the previous owner, Ray Sullivan, a truck driver, had inexplicably disappeared. At a rest stop, Ray's truck was discovered idle, the sleeper bed vacant, and there was no indication of the driver's whereabouts. Ray was seen on security film into his berth for the night, but never coming out. However, other film from the same era showed a man who looked just like Ray driving his truck across the nation. Eventually, the copy had left the truck and vanished, most likely to use Ray's stolen identity to start over, because he suspected what had happened, but was unable to prove it. The owner of the salvage yard had been frantic to sell the berth. Marcus made every effort to sever his relationship with the entity. He had a priest perform an exorcism, burned sage to purge negative energy, and bless the berth with holy water. Nothing was successful. Marcus could feel himself growing weaker, more translucent, and less attached to his own body as the creature grew stronger every night. Marcus's decision to remain awake and face the monster as it manifested was the last confrontation. He was horrified to see his duplicate became firm enough to create shadows in the gloomy light as it solidified on the bird. The duplicate's eyes were pitch black when it opened them, as if it were gazing into dark wells that did not reflect any light. In Marcus's own words, the duplicate said, "You can't stop this. Years have passed while I waited in this berth, becoming stronger with every dreamer who fed me. You'll be nothing more than a memory that fades with the dawn, and soon I'll have enough substance to live on my own." Marcus made an effort to combat the monster, but like vapor, his hands moved through it. Marcus was already more ghost than man, too faded to affect the physical world, the copy said. Laughing, every night, the thing had been stealing fragments of Marcus' essence and utilizing them to construct a flawless substitute. 3 weeks later, Marcus' truck was discovered at a rest area in Montana, with the engine running and everything missing, save for a faintly human-looking outline on the mattress. At truck stops across the nation, the new owner of Marcus Identity has been seen living Marcus life to the fullest and entertaining other truckers with tales of adventures Marcus never had. The berth was once more sold to an unwary truck driver, and so the cycle goes on, as the originals fade into nothing more than impressions on a mattress, where nightmares are born and dreams go to die. The sleeper berth that dreams alone is waiting for its next victim somewhere on America's highways, ready to slowly consume another driver's essence while they sleep, creating perfect duplicates that walk away with stolen lives. 9. The only exit that shows up at 3:33 a.m. for 9 years. Leonard Hayes had been traveling the same route from Tucson to El Paso, transporting vehicle parts on Interstate 10 over the desert. Between the two cities, he was familiar with every exit, rest area, and mile marker. For this reason, at precisely 3:33 a.m., exit 66 became into view in his headlights. In August 2021, during a night without a moon, Leonard realized that something was seriously wrong with the planet. There was no map showing the exit. For years, Leonard had examined dock construction reports, GPS systems, and highway atlases, and he had never seen an exit 66B on this section of I-10.65. 67 and 69 were the numbers of the standard exits. No 66 of any kind, much less a 66B, was present. However, it was there, conspicuously marked with the typical green highway signs, replete with reflective text that shone brightly in the dark and attracted his headlights. Pishin Township, services available, was written on the exit sign, with the recognizable green background with white letters that denoted each highway off-ramp in the United States. However, Leonard was unaware about Pishin Township. Additionally, his chart showed that 450 meters in all directions, this area of desert was made up entirely of barren terrain. Leonard's logbook stated he was making good time, and his fuel gauge showed he had enough diesel to get to El Paso. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, something regarding the he was forced by the sign to slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, the exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. It seemed as though the blackness itself was absorbing the light from Leonard's headlights, which only peaked a few yards ahead. It also felt old on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. It was followed by a two-lane road that vanished into a total, seemingly solid blackness. Apart from a dilapidated wooden sign that stated Pishin Township, population 0 in faded white paint, there were no building lights, no street lights, and no other indications of civilization. It would have been better for Leonard to turn around at that point, go back on the highway, and act as though he had never spotted the impossibly difficult exit. However, truck drivers are naturally inquisitive, and the mystery of this secret community drew him in, a fishing line fastened to his head. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Pishin Township had cracks, and weeds were sprouting in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible via Leonard's headlights, a petrol station, stores, homes, and even what appeared to be a tiny church with a twisted steeple. However, all of the buildings had been deserted, dark, and black for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings, despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for years. The paint looked new, The windows were unbroken, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. After parking his vehicle in front of what looked like a general store, Leonard got out of his cab. The quiet was unchangeable. No insects, no breeze, and no distant interstate traffic noises. His footfall also sounded muffled, as though the air itself was too dense to transmit sound clearly. The front door of the general shop was unlocked. Leonard discovered shelves filled with items that, while initially appearing normal, turned out to be incorrect. The brand labels on canned foods were familiar, if slightly different. Instead of soup, use Campbell's soap, Coca-Cola as an alternative. Iraq-related newspapers from different years all have the same headline. Strange dreams are reported by locals. The investigation is still ongoing. Leonard's blood ran cold as he discovered a guest register book behind the counter. Names, dates, and signatures of persons who had reportedly visited Petition Township with the previous few decades were scattered throughout the pages. The dates, however, were not feasible. Many of the writings were in handwriting that appeared to develop and evolve as Leonard looked on, while some were from years before the town could have existed and others were from the future. For 9 years, Leonard Hayes had been transporting auto parts across the desert on Interstate 10, between Tucson and El Paso, between the two cities. He was familiar with every exit, rest area, and mile marker. For this reason, when exit 66B showed up in his headlights precisely at 3:33 a.m. in August 2021, during a night without a moon, Leonard realized that something was seriously wrong with the planet. There was no map showing the exit. For years, Leonard had examined dock construction reports, GPS systems, and highway atlases, and he had never seen an exit 66B on this section of I-10.65. 67 and 69 were the numbers of the standard exits. No 66 of any kind, much less a 66B, was present. However, it was there, conspicuously marked with the typical green highway signs, replete with reflective text that shone brightly in the dark and attracted his headlights. Leonard had never heard of Petition Township, but the exit sign said, Petition Township, services available in the familiar white letters on green background that marked every interstate off-ramp across America. Additionally, his charts showed that this area of desert was entirely devoid of land, in all directions for 50 miles. Leonard's logbook stated he was making good time, and his fuel gauge showed he had enough diesel to get to El Paso. It made little sense to take an unmarked exit that led to a non-existent town. However, there was something about the sign that made him slow down, turn right, and steer his 18-wheeler down the off-ramp into whatever was beyond the familiar glow of the interstate. Longer than necessary, the exit ramp descended slowly into a darkness that appeared thicker than usual at night. It seemed as though the blackness itself was absorbing the light from Leonard's headlights, which only peaked a few yards ahead. It also felt odd on the pavement beneath his wheels. It seemed older and rougher, as though it had been constructed decades before the current interstate system. Leonard discovered a stop sign at the bottom of the ramp that appeared to have been hand-painted rather than manufactured. Beyond it lay a two-lane road, so complete it appeared concrete, disappearing into darkness, apart from a dilapidated wooden sign that stated Petition Township, population 0, in faded white paint. There were no building lights, no street lights, and no other indications of civilization. It was time for Leonard to turn around. He ought to have re-entered the interstate and acted as though he had never noticed the impossibly difficult exit. However, the mystery of this hidden town drew him in a fishing line hooked in his brain, and truck drivers are naturally intrigued. He put the car in first gear and rolled into the night. The paved road through Petition Township had cracks, and weeds were sprouting in almost intentional patterns through the asphalt. Buildings on both sides of the street were visible via Leonard's headlights. A petrol station, stores, homes, and even what appeared to be a tiny church with a twisted steeple. However, All of the buildings had been deserted, dark and black, for so long that nature had started to take them back. Despite the obvious abandonment, everything appeared so well preserved that it made Leonard's skin crawl. There were no indications of structural collapse, fire damage, or vandalism on the buildings, despite the eerie silence that suggested no one had lived here for years. The paint looked new, the windows were unbroken, and the doors hung straight on their hinges. After parking his vehicle in front of what looked like a general store, Leonard got out of his cab. There was complete quiet. No insects, no breeze, and no distant interstate traffic noises. His footfall even sounded muted, as though sound could not travel through the air because it was too thick. The front door of the general shop was unlocked. Leonard discovered shelves filled with items that, while initially appearing normal, turned out to be incorrect. The brand labels on canned foods were familiar, if slightly different. Instead of soup, use Campbell's soap, Coca-Cola as opposed to Coca-Cola. Iraq-related newspapers were dated from different years, yet the headline was the same for all of them. Strange dreams are reported by locals. The investigation is still ongoing. Leonard's blood ran cold as he discovered a guest register book behind the counter. Names, dates, and signatures of persons who had reportedly visited Petition Township during the previous few decades were scattered throughout the pages. The dates, however, were not feasible. Many of the notes were written in handwriting that appeared to develop and evolve as Leonard watched, while others were from years before the town could have existed. During his 16 years on the road, interstate stalker Eddie Castellanos had transported every kind of freight imaginable, but nothing had prepared him for the package he picked up on a steamy September night in 2022 from a funeral facility in Savannah, Georgia. According to the manifest, it was mortuary equipment headed for a New Orleans cemetery. Additionally, Eddie was greeted at the loading dock by the funeral director, who strangely insisted that the delivery be made before the sun comes up. 6 elaborate wooden caskets, each made of dark mahogany with brass fittings that shone in the fluorescent lights of the loading dock, made up the cargo. These were exquisitely crafted coffins, the type that affluent families commissioned for their departed loved ones. Eddie found it strange that they were so weighty. The funeral director assured everyone that the caskets were empty, but it took a forklift to load each one. When Eddie asked about the weight, the funeral director said it was premium construction, lead-lined solid wood for preservation. The New Orleanian families value fine craftsmanship. However, while he signed the papers, his hands trembled, and he kept looking over his shoulder, as though he was waiting for someone to come out of the shadowed funeral house. They seemed to settle into the trailer bed with unusual finality, as if they belonged there, Eddie said, adding extra straps and chains to secure the caskets in his trailer. He was given a sealed envelope with detailed delivery instructions by the funeral director, who also stressed that under no circumstances can a casket be opened while being transported. The first hour of the drive went smoothly as Eddie made his way toward Interstate 16 through the suburban sprawl of Savannah. But as he got on the freeway and started to cruise, he saw that his truck was working harder than it should, that his engine had to work harder to keep up, and that hills that should have been simple climbs were now difficult. To check his load, Eddie pulled into a weigh station outside of Moan. His blood ran cold at the scale reading. His truck was significantly heavier than the 80,000 pounds legal limit, weighing close to 120,000 pounds. However, his manifest states that the 6 caskets should have only increased his weight by roughly 3,000 pounds. In the first 100 meters of the trip, his baggage had somehow increased in weight by 40,000 pounds. Chuck, a seasoned veteran who worked as a weigh station inspector, strolled about Eddie's trailer looking perplexed. "Your axle weights are off the charts," Chuck remarked while looking at his clipboard. Even as he spoke, Eddie could feel his truck sinking a little, as if the cargo was still gaining weight. "But I can't see how 6 empty coffins could weigh This much. You sure there's nothing else in that trailer? Eddie assured Chuck that he was only transporting the caskets listed on his manifest. Chuck looked hesitant to write a ticket for something he couldn't explain, but he did make notes on his citation pad. Eddie's truck found it difficult to achieve 40 miles per hour on flat terrain once they were back on the highway. Eddie had to use his hazard lights to alert faster traffic to his presence, while other cars honked angrily as they passed his crawling tractor. The engine temperature gauge was gradually approaching the red zone, and his fuel usage had increased. Around midnight, Eddie started to hear noises coming from his trailer as he got closer to the Georgia-Alabama line. Initially, the only sounds were cracking and settling, which may be attributed to the excessive shifting of weights during turns and stops. But over time, the noises grew more purposeful and regular, like someone tapping on wood from within. There was a pattern to the knocking, 3 slow taps, followed by another 3 taps and a break. Eddie's cab was filled with an unsettling drumbeat that seemed to emanate from all 6 caskets at once and reverberated through the trailer walls. The knocking became louder and more forceful. He tried to turn up his radio to block out the sound, as though whatever was within the caskets was pleading for his attention. Eddie arrived at a 24-hour parking lot. He walked back to check his trailer after seeing a truck stop close to Montgomery. The caskets had the same appearance as when they were loaded. Gorgeous, pricey, and securely fastened. However, Eddie felt tremors through the wood of the closest coffin when he put his hand on it, as though something was shifting inside. Even though the night air was cool, the brass fittings felt warm to the touch. As Eddie was checking his goods, a fellow trucker called Sam happened to stroll by. I could hear you coming from a great distance. Sounds like you got some unhappy passengers back there, Sam remarked. Eddie's explanation of the weight issues and the enigmatic noises caused Sam's visage to darken. I've heard stories about shipments like this, Sam said. Cargo that makes noise when it should be silent. Coffins that get heavier the farther you haul them. Sam's supernatural explanation was rejected by Eddie, but he couldn't ignore the evidence of his own senses. His truck was now so heavy that it could barely climb the slightest incline, and the knocking from the trailer had changed to what sounded like scratching, with dozens of fingernails clawing at wood from the inside. Word has it that some funeral homes don't always wait for people to be completely dead before they box them up. Sometimes people are buried alive, and their spirits can't rest until they're properly laid to rest. Eddie's heater was running full blast as he struggled across Alabama, but the temperature inside his cab started to drop. Ice crystals formed on his windows. His breath came out in visible puffs. The scratching sounds became more desperate, and there were what sounded like muffled voices calling for a help in languages Eddie didn't understand. And worst of all, a foul stench, not the antiseptic stench of embalming fluid, but the sweet, sickening smell of decay, mixed with something else, something that made Eddie think of wet earth and old graveyards, and the smell got stronger every mile until he had to breathe through his mouth to keep from gagging. A portable scale at a rest area indicated that Eddie's truck weighed over 200,000 pounds by the time he reached the Mississippi border, and his tires were showing signs of dangerous stress. The trailer axles were groaning under the impossible load, and the knocking and scratching from the caskets had gotten so loud that other truckers at the rest area could hear them from 50 yards away. Eddie tried calling the Savannah Funeral Home, but there was no answer. He tried the New Orleans Cemetery, but no one picked up, even at this late hour. The sealed envelope's delivery instructions took him to an address that his GPS indicated didn't exist, and he was stuck hauling a load that was literally crushing his truck while carrying cargo that seemed intent on clawing its way out of confinement. As Eddie got closer to Louisiana, the voices from the trailer became more distinct. He could hear individual cries for assistance, accounts of being buried alive, and accusations aimed at the funeral home that had shipped them. The voices described being buried too soon, waking up in the dark and discovering they had been declared dead while still conscious, and tearing at coffin lids until their fingers bled. Eddie became increasingly horrified when he realized he wasn't carrying empty caskets. The climax came when Eddie's truck finally gave up completely on the outskirts of New Orleans. The engine seized, the trailer axle snapped, and the entire rig collapsed. I was carrying the bodies of people who had been buried alive, whose spirits were trapped in their coffins, and growing stronger with each mile away from the place where they'd been wrongfully interred. The weight increase wasn't physical, it was spiritual. Eddie crawled out of the wreckage, hearing the caskets behind him split open, spilling decades of accumulated suffering into the Louisiana night. 6 figures appeared from the ruined trailer, but they weren't zombies or ghosts. They were the spiritual remains of people who had been buried too soon, who had died in agony, whose anger had fermented in wooden boxes until it became something that could affect the physical world. They headed purposefully toward the lights of New Orleans, looking for the funeral directors and dishonest officials who had benefited from their hasty burial. Eddie survived the encounter, but he never drove a truck again, and he spent weeks in mental hospitals, rambling about caskets that held the concentrated rage of the wrongfully deceased and cargo that got heavier by the mile. The insurance investigation determined that Eddie had damaged his own truck on purpose for experiencing a mental breakdown. The 6 figures were never seen again, but neither the extraordinary weight readings nor the testimony of dozens of witnesses who had heard the sounds coming from his trailer could be explained. However, inexplicable issues, equipment malfunctions, unexplainable mishaps, and employees quitting after reporting contacts with angry spirits demanding retribution for the prematurely buried were all commonplace in funeral facilities around the Gulf Coast. Some goods are too big for any truck to handle, particularly when the weight is not from actual cargo, rather from the cumulative pain of those who passed away too soon and won't stop until their stories are spoken.